All right, so this video is going to give you some tips and tricks as you are trying to do your revisions for your JFK rhetorical analysis essays. I've taken some exemplars. I have given a couple tips in here about like what we can do to beef up our analysis and to make our rhetorical analysis essays superb. So to begin with, I have two focus areas for revision. The first one is reinforcing the claim. So that is one that I think I wrote on a lot of people's essays. I've written questions like, how does this relate to JFK's overall purpose? Or how is this really ultimately going to convince the audience that JFK is right, that the steel companies are wrong? Or how does this really convince them that they should be against the steel companies? So we're circling back to JFK's purpose in the speech whenever we analyze a quote. A lot of people are really, really good at talking about how the audience connects with the quote, but we're having trouble kind of going back and relating it to the overall speech, like what's going on in that specific moment. So we'll talk about that. The other thing I want to talk about today is getting really specific about our audience connection. So we're really great at figuring out how audiences will connect. I'm seeing a lot of excellent references to ethos, pathos, and logos. I'm seeing a lot of just really great connections where people are saying this is the historical information. This is what audiences might think. But we're not as good at exploring that connection in detail. So the question I have is, how do we show connection rather than tell? It's kind of like, you know, that age-old, how do we show, don't tell in like narrative writing? But we really want to like pull out specific words and phrases from the text or discuss specific values and beliefs from the audience to help expand our analysis. So to begin with, I did get a couple questions about introductions and how we can write better introductions or what kinds of information would be good to have in an introduction. So I found a stellar introduction paragraph that really showcases everything that I would be looking for in an introduction paragraph. Now, an intro, as you might have discovered if you watched the AP review video that I posted last week or the week before, it's a really great place to introduce what you know about the rhetorical situation. So giving that historical context, telling us who is speaking, why they're speaking, who they're speaking to. It's a really great opportunity to just kind of lay out, okay, reader, here's what's happening. And then obviously we want to transition smoothly into the thesis statement. You can pause and read this beautiful example of a rhetorical analysis introduction. I'm not really going to read the whole thing to you, but I love how this person starts with the larger scope, even going beyond what was offered in the actual introduction to the prompt. The dangerous enemy, the Soviet Union, is threatening the United States. That was a really cool introduction. So if you want to pause and read that, that's totally cool. Here is a fantastic rhetorical analysis paragraph, and what I've done is I've highlighted each of the different pieces. We're going to go through it and just show you, like, here's an exemplar of what it could look like. Now, obviously, I've said this before, there's no, like, real, like, cookie cutter, this is exactly how or where you're going to put these things. But I just want to show you an example of how one person has really done this well. So they start with a fantastic topic sentence, the strategy and the purpose of the strategy. Kennedy exposes the steel company's lack of compassion for Americans as they struggle to get by under uncertain circumstances in order to demonstrate the company's selfish behavior. It's great. Next, we have our evidence, and the evidence demonstrates that strategy that this person is introducing to us. He writes, at a time when restraint and sacrifice are being asked of every citizen, the American people will find it hard, as I do, to accept a situation in which a tiny handful of steel executives whose pursuit of private power and profit exceeds their sense of public responsibility can show such utter contempt for the interests of 185 million Americans. Great quote. Now we're jumping right in this example into the audience connection. Kennedy puts himself in the average American's shoes demonstrating his understanding for the difficulty they are facing. By doing so, he expresses concern for his fellow citizens and shows them that he cares, though the steel companies do not. So that whole like creating that relationship, this person is very subtly talking about ethos without actually saying ethos, which is pretty sophisticated. Then they go on and they start to pull out those specific words and phrases. So I would call this explaining the evidence. So what is the evidence doing? What does it mean? And you can you could flip these. It's okay to start with the explaining. It's okay to start with the connecting. But this person says, by directly accusing the steel executives of caring more about their own private power and profit rather than the good of the American public, he questions their values and character. So that's really kind of like a great explanation of what he's really doing that we might not get as readers, on our first run through. So it's kind of nice that this person is really spelling that out. And they're also pulling out a key word or phrase that's really going to help us out. And then we're going, this is where the reinforcing the claim, circling back to the purpose. This is all about the purpose that's in your thesis statement. So he demonstrates that these companies have taken advantage of vulnerable Americans, forcing them to acknowledge and justify their rising prices to an unhappy group of citizens. By exposing the steel companies' lack of compassion for American citizens, he portrays them as selfish and argues that prices shouldn't have been raised. So this person's thesis statement definitely discusses the purpose of JFK's speech as showing or arguing that prices should not be raised. So they're going to be wanting every paragraph to talk about how this proves that prices shouldn't be raised. Maybe your purpose is that JFK wants to prove to the American people that he's on their side. If that's the case, you're going to have a very different connection to the claim. You're going to want to talk about what makes him feel like a perfect leader for them. You're going to want to talk about what makes them feel like they can trust him. If your discussion is about turning the Americans against the steel companies and making them hate the steel companies, you're really going to want to talk about how is this going to turn the Americans against them? So it's a little bit different depending on what your thesis statement was, but you always want to go back and talk about that claim. What is he trying to do? How does this really relate to the purpose of the speech? Our next example, we're going to go through and we're going to see, does this have all of the parts? So we've got our topic sentence. Not only does this affect the American defense and security, it also affects the general public. Kennedy makes sure to appeal to Americans by outlining how it will ultimately affect them as well. So we're talking about the purpose. He's appealing to those Americans, that strategy, outlining how it will ultimately affect them as well. That's great. We've got our quote. He explains that if this rise in the cost of steel is imitated by the rest of the industry instead of rescinded, it would increase the cost of homes, autos, appliances, and most other items for every American family. Really effective strategy. A lot of you picked up on this, and that's so great. This is going to reach out to Americans really well, right? Here's our explanation. By including the effects of the increased prices that the audience could relate to, relating audience, Kennedy allows the audience to recognize that the increase in steel prices could end up affecting their daily life. Now, this does have a little bit of like audience in it, so I kind of overlapped a little bit. So you see like my next part. With this appeal to pathos, a sense of panic can be spread because this could mean that Americans can no longer afford the essential items that they need. So that gets pretty specific about why an American is really going to reach out. Unfortunately, there's no more paragraph left. We have not connected back to our claim in this paragraph. So this is a great opportunity. The question, what can we do? What can we add to connect back to his claim? Now that would require that we know what the thesis statement is. So I've given an exemplar here on the next slide. So if I wanted my purpose is that JFK does blah, 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 all the strategies in order to turn the American public against the steel companies, then this might be something that I would say. This paints the steel companies as an enemy to American family life, a life that many Americans would loathe to give up for the sake of a few greedy steel executives. So when I'm explaining and going back to the quote, to the claim, I am really trying to circle it back to that overall like message, right? So that sense of panic, appeal to pathos is excellent, but it really isn't as grounded in the like getting people against the steel companies as it could be. So we need that extra sentence. It's kind of like that last punch to say like, and this is how this ultimately drives the whole speech. This is how it ultimately gets done what JFK wants to have done, right? So if I were going to use this as a way to show that for JFK to prove that he's on the American side, I might say something like this by JFK mentioning this effect, it helps Americans to believe that he knows what they need and he is aware of the issues that could cause their lives to be more difficult. And if a president is bringing this up before they even know what could happen, then that's going to make them feel more able to trust somebody who has their best interests in mind. So that might be something for a different purpose. There's a lot of layers to the purpose of this speech. I don't know if you noticed, but it's kind of just like pick one and run with it. Also, another great opportunity for some sophistication because you can kind of balance two different purposes at the same time. Like you're talking to the American people, you're trying to convince them, but at the same time, you've got this kind of like low key trying to shame the steel companies because they're listening too. It's a lot. Here's an example of a really great paragraph that has everything that it needs, but could get more detailed in terms of audience connection and into that analysis piece. That was the second revision strategy that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation. So this new paragraph, by accusing large corporations of being irresponsible, JFK threatens their reputation in the nation. American people will find it hard, as I do, to accept a situation. Is this quote getting familiar to you? Because it was a very popular one. I'm going to let you read the rest of it. JFK is tying in the fact that what these companies are doing is not only not in the interest of the US government, but the American people as well. This will help Kennedy connect with his audience because he is making them feel as though these companies' actions are directly impacting them, while also turning the heat of their anger onto these companies. For competitive businesses such as the steel companies, reputability is essential to business. This is his attempt at publicly shaming these companies into changing. So it's great. We're very accurate. Like, yes, this is definitely going to make the audience feel like those companies are directly impacting them. It's also going to probably make them angry. But we have an opportunity to get more specific about how do we know from the quote that that's really going to make them angry. So how can we be more specific about addressing the quote in our analysis? What words or phrases could we pull out of our evidence to examine more closely? So let's look. The anger, right? The heat, like making them feel as if their actions are directly impacting them. I like that sense of public responsibility, right? I like that sense of like utter contempt, private power. Americans might have that value of public responsibility of serving your country that these kind of go against. So here's my example. I've kind of expanded it. Look how much larger now my analysis is. The AP review videos are suggesting that you have at least 2 or 3 sentences of analysis per quote. So we want to make sure that we're analyzing as much as possible. So I have added another sentence. Americans, especially during a time of chaos overseas, would likely disapprove of actions that lack a sense of public responsibility. There it is. I like that. Especially with many Americans making sacrifices for the greater good of their nation. So what I'm doing, I'm connecting to the historical context, the experiences that Americans might be having right now. I am pulling a quote out that shows public responsibility that kind of ties in with that idea of public service and serving your country. And then I'm kind of going, I'm adding a little bit more to my connecting to the claim, showing, quote, utter contempt for Americans would be a dangerous reputation for steel companies to shoulder, since for competitive businesses such as steel companies, reputability is essential for business. This is his attempt at publicly shaming these companies into changing in order to save face. So I'm kind of trying to make it a little bit more clear why he's shaming these companies and what he wants them to do. So again, there's no like set way of doing this. It's all in the choices that you're making. You have a lot of power as a writer to decide what words and phrases you're going to pull out, what key things that you're going to focus on, but the idea is to choose something. The idea is to pull something out and show your readers that you're really considering what's in that quote, that you're really considering what it is, those specific words and phrases, that specific information that's really going to reach out to people. I hope this is helpful. And if you have any questions at all, please reach out to me. I am willing to send specific videos on your particular essay if you need it, to reach out in any way, and we can get working on our essays.